panel. The panel is vulnerable workers, domestic workers, and farm workers in the United States and beyond. My name is Juan De Lara. I'm an assistant professor here at USC in the Department of American Studies. I'm a political and economic geographer, and my work is on social movement, activism, and global economic development. So today, like I said, we have a great panel. We have, I will introduce everyone, and then as each person speaks, we'll give you a more detailed biographical sketch of each person. So today we have Aquilina Soriano-Versoza. She's the director of the Filipino Workers Center of Los Angeles. We also have Pardis, Mahdavi, who's an associate professor of anthropology at Pomona College, and Chancee, Martorell, who is the founder and executive director of the Thai Community Development Center. We also have Ruben Garcia, a professor of law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and David Lopez, who's general counsel for the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So, we are going to start today by having Pardis Mahdavi talk to us about some of the work that she's been doing. And she is a associate professor and chair of anthropology at Pomona College. Her research interests include gender, labor, migration, sexuality, human rights, youth culture, transnational feminism, and public health in the context of changing global and political structures. She's done a lot of work. Her first book is Passionate Uprising, Iran's Sexual Revolution, was published with Stanford University Press in 2008, and her second book, Gridlock, Labor, Migration, and Human Trafficking in Dubai, also is published through Stanford University Press. It was published in 2011. She has received fellowships and awards from institutions such as Google Ideas, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the National Drug Research Institute, the American Public Health Association, and the Society for Applied Anthropology. And she's also consulted for a wide number of organizations, including the U.S. government, Google, and the United Nations. So, Pardis, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank the organizers for putting on such a fantastic conference. It's really great to have the opportunity to have dialogue across and outside the academy. We are, as an academic community, locked in our ivory tower, so it's really nice to be able to come out and have these conversations. As an anthropologist, I'd like to start with the story of the night. One of the questions I was asked is to talk about what the experiences of labor migrants are, and I think that one of the best ways to demonstrate that is by telling the story of one of my interlocutors, whom I've been following for the last 6 or 7 years. She's a young woman named Chancee, an Ethiopian woman who migrated to Dubai initially to work as a domestic worker, but has for the last 3 or 4 years been working in the sex industry in Dubai. So her trajectory is quite interesting to think about when we consider the stereotypes and the paradigms that we hear a lot in policy discourse around trafficking versus labor migration. So Mesquite's father was killed by rebel forces near the border with Eritrea. Her mother was left with 4 daughters, quite distraught and afraid for her life. Mesquite and her mother had heard that there was a lot of work in the Gulf, as many women in particular had been migrating to work as domestic workers in places like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, etc. So she went to her local labor agency in Addis Ababa. But there she was told that because she was a single woman and under the age of 30, that it was going to be complicated for her to leave the country. She was told she would either need a signature from her father, who had just been killed. She was told she would need to process a lot of paperwork. In short, she was told it would take about a year for her to get a permit to be able to actually leave Ethiopia and go and migrate. And this was as a result of policies that had been enacted ostensibly to protect women from being trafficked. But in this case, what happened was it led Mesquite to meet an informal broker, or what some might call a trafficker, who said that he would secure her passage to Dubai. She had to borrow a sum in the amount of $700, which is fairly significant. And this is, again, when we get into this, the whole debt bondage, because people borrow significant sums of money before leaving, and then one of the issues is they can't return home empty-handed for fear of a whole host of issues. So she signed the contract with this informal broker, borrowed the $700, and was on her way to Dubai. When she was there, she was very worried about, her safety and her life. She also was unsure whether she was a legal migrant, and so was very afraid to go to the Ethiopian embassy. When one night he came to her room, she sort of fought him back and was able to escape that night. But the next day she ran to the police station. When she got to the police station, unfortunately, that's where she was raped. And she was held for 3 days, and then her employer was called. Now, it's important to note that the police in Dubai are largely imported, because over 90% of Dubai's population are migrant workers, and the police, in fact, are also migrants, who do not receive any training on working with survivors. So she was raped and held for 3 days. On the 3rd day, her employer was called, and he was called to come and pick her up and take her home. That's sort of what they were told to do. When he took her home, he locked her up in a room for 3 days without food. On the 4th day, she ran away again, this time to her local church, where she met a large number of other Ethiopian women who were working in the sex industry. What she told me is, she said that these women made it sound so much easier, so much more lucrative to be in the sex industry, that she actually decided then and there that she was going to abscond from her work as a domestic worker, which makes her illegal right away when you abscond, because you no longer have a sponsor, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And went into the sex industry, which then, when I talked to her a year later, she said she was much happier working as a sex worker than she ever had been as a domestic worker, because she actually saw the money, it came directly to her, and then she could send it home. So the question is, what's going on here? What's happening that people are preferring to work in the sex industry, preferring to move into the informal economy than the formal economy? So migration in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, such as the Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, etc., is structured by a kafala system, which is a sponsorship system. So your legal dependence in the country depends on your sponsor. Now, people ask me often, what's it like to be a labor migrant in Dubai? And I say, it's extremely variable. If you have a good sponsor, it can be pretty good. If you don't have a good sponsor, that can be really difficult. And furthermore, if you don't know who your sponsor is, it can get even more complicated. So one of the groups of people who are not the subject of today's panel is construction workers, but they actually tended to be the ones that were most often trafficked in my experiences. They were the ones most experiencing forced fraud and coercion, in addition to domestic workers. But many of the construction workers I spoke with, for instance, had no idea who their sponsor was, because there were so many levels of middlemen. There was, a manager and then a person above that. Some people said that by the time they got to their Emirati kafil or their sponsor, that their problem was solved. But getting there were 3 or 4 different middlemen, and so the problem was also multi-layered. So the kafala system is not dissimilar from those who might be familiar with Bracero program, the guest worker program here, in that it has a lot of different parameters. Now, with the case of domestic workers fall outside the kafala system in terms of rights protections. So what does that mean? That means that they're beholden to the same rules of kafala, such as they can't have their children visit them, they can't bring their families with them, they are completely dependent on their sponsor, but they are not able to access any rights under kafala. Right? So that is a big problem. Now, the typical portraiture of trafficking globally in U.S. discourse, of course, is young girls in the sex industry kidnapped, and I think our keynote speaker this morning talked about that the villains are dark-skinned men. In this case, in this day and age, post 9/11, they often have Middle Eastern accents. For a pop culture version of that, I would direct you to the film Taken with Liam Neeson, which of course at the end the bad guys are the Arab men, and they're on this boat in the Gulf, and they're sort of buying and trading the flesh of white women. That's the trope. The reality is, of course, as I said, much more complicated. More often than not, it's men in the Gulf and domestic workers. And so here you have, there was a large number of women that I met who actually had migrated from domestic work into sex work. So as I mentioned, the reality is more complicated. And as we've heard a lot this morning, the policies are not able to keep up with the reality. And in fact, the policies are quite disconnected from the reality, making it more difficult, making the lives of migrant workers more complicated and making them more vulnerable. So the second question that I was asked in the prompts was, what was the U.S. foreign policy I critiqued and what were its effects across countries? Now, my main critique was of the TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report. I share the frustration of many scholars in noting that the compilation of the TIP report is extremely opaque. People who are actually writing the report spend anywhere from 2 days to maybe 2 weeks in country. For those of us, some people like me, I've been working in the Gulf for 10 years. And we understand that there are many layers of what's happening. Somebody parachuting into a country for 2 days is not really going to get at the heart of it. And at one point I talked with a desk officer and I said, well, how are you getting your information? And they said, well, you know, it's just sort of what I've observed. When I observed more sex workers, when I observed, you know, more clubs having more clientele, I think the trafficking is worse. So more than just there being a conflation of sex work and trafficking is also the other compilation of the report. It's also increasingly couched in a criminalization framework, encouraging prosecution as opposed to protection. And the TIP sort of has a lot of biases by race, class, and gender. And what I mean by that is we talk a little bit about the tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 1 tends to be countries that the U.S. Considers friend, and then, you know, such, you know, European countries in particular. Tier 2 are the countries that it's sort of like, I'm not so sure about. Tier 2 watch list, which is where the UAE was, it's now moved up. Again, are countries that are marginal, and then of course Tier 3 are countries like Iran, Cuba, North Korea, etc. And the example that I always use is, so Italy is on Tier 1, Iran is on Tier 3. You know, what's happening there? I'm Iranian. I spent a lot of time working on Iran. There aren't many people coming in or out of Iran's borders. It's very difficult to get in or out, and not a whole lot of that type of trafficking, which of course is what is written in the TIP report, except when you get to the 3rd paragraph, where there's a sentence at the end of the 3rd paragraph saying, though data is very hard to collect on Iran. So Iran is placed in Tier 3, subject to non-humanitarian sanctions, but we're not really sure why that is. So these are the sort of critiques that I had in my book, and I don't have time to kind of get into all of them, but as I mentioned, I feel that these policies are disconnected with lived experience. Now, the countries like the UAE are put in a tough position. They're on the Tier 2 watch list. The U.S. is one of the UAE's largest trading partners. So of course, they don't want to be placed on the watch list. Now, the recommendations made to the UAE were quite clear. Tighten borders, increase law enforcement. So increase cops, right? Now, I just mentioned to you the story of the young woman who was raped by the cops. This is not unusual. So rather than saying increase labor inspectors, they're asking for an increase in cops. And tighten borders, as we just mentioned. When you tighten borders, people are more driven to go underground. And so this is the phenomenon, one of my interlocutors called it the closing the door but opening the window phenomenon, where, you know, when policies are enacted to make it more difficult to migrate, you know, making migration reliant on a signature from a man, or more training, or more bureaucracy, or being of a certain age, it just results in more people kind of going out the window, as one of my interlocutors would say. The biggest issue with the policy was that there was an organic movement taking place in the UAE to actually reform and potentially abolish the kafala system, which would have been the single most productive thing that could take place to actually fight trafficking in the region, because it would give migrants back their rights. When the UAE was put on a watch list in the TIP report, and when the issue was suddenly hyper-focused on sex, the support for reforming and abolishing kafala, which had happened in Bahrain, not too far away, was completely eclipsed. And instead, everything became focused on the sex industry. And so, while today things have improved in that labor is now seen as an issue, they haven't improved in terms of the way in which the compilation of the reports take place, the focus on prosecution, and the policies to tighten borders even more. For a recent example, Qatar is actually now considering enacting a policy where in the home and host countries, these sort of bilateral policies where the home and host countries have to agree on the parameters of the migrant movement, what happens is more and more people actually go underground. And MPI has done significant research on this when we had the case of the Saudi Arabia-Philippines bilateral agreement, which actually resulted in more Indonesians becoming trafficked to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi said, oh, okay, if I now have to make sure that these women work no more than 40 hours a week, if they're coming from the Philippines, let me turn to Indonesia to recruit. So this, of course, becomes a problem when these policies are done. And finally, the framing of the problem eclipses root issues such as poverty, structural adjustment programs, structural violence, war, and the things that make people have to migrate in the first place. So the way the policies are written make it seem as though it's an individual issue rather than a larger macro social issue, which is again what I've critiqued a lot in my book. So the final question I was asked was, how does the case of Dubai labor migrants speak to the greater war on sex trafficking, and what fresh perspectives could be gained? I think it's of note that many of the migrants I met wanted to move into the sex industry, which they saw as comparatively better than other types of employment, particularly domestic workers who figured that they were outside of kafala anyway, they were outside of any type of rights protection, so they might as well be illegal. That's what I had one interlocutor here say, but at least have control over their funding. Migrants in Dubai are also activists. They are much more organized than we think, and much recent scholarship on migration has flattened the identities of men and women who migrate. And so all we read about, all we hear about is just, women migrants, men migrants. But we have to recognize that these individuals have multidimensional identities, and in the Gulf in particular, because there are laws banning the creation of official NGOs, these migrants wear many hats, and you have lots of informal activism, lots of organizing taking place, particularly amongst co-ethnics. So many of the people that I saw get out of the tricky situations they were in, it was with the support of co-ethnics. So it's important to note that many are organizing for a reform of kafala and organizing to help their counterparts, but these are the efforts that need more support rather than law enforcement. And on a more macro level, we need to look at these disconnects between policy and lived experience, which show the myopic focus of the policies that operate to the detriment of those they're supposed to help. One of the things I argue in my book is that you see a type of racialized morality inherent in these policies, and also gender, right? So a young man that I worked with a lot, a young man from India, who was trying to access rights under the trafficking framework, was actually laughed at when he went to actually do that into the trafficking task squad in Dubai, because he was told men are not trafficked. So again, we have sort of race, class, and gender playing a role in both the rhetoric and in the operationalization of these policies. So, I just kind of want to end with sort of a take-home message that my colleague Denise Brennan often talks about, which is basically the fight for migrants' rights is a fight against trafficking. And so that can actually be our most powerful tool.
Great. So are you going to come back, or?
I'll stay for as long.
Okay, all right. I just want to know if we should give people an opportunity to ask you questions now, if you have to leave. Pardis is a very young baby, and she may have to leave. So maybe what we should do now is, if anyone has direct questions for her, you can ask now in case she has to leave later. So why don't we do that? Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
So Pardis, the people who ended up moving from domestic work where they were trafficked to the position of sex worker into the sex industry where they felt more free, what was their status there? I mean, was it actually sort of a positive and lucrative experience for them, or was it also hazardous because of police brutality or other factors?
Thank you. That's a great question. It was both, right? So for some, it was positive because they felt that they were able to be more. One woman said, "I feel I can be more invisible this way," because she didn't have one employer, so she could kind of choose her hours and she could kind of come and go as she pleased, and she didn't experience any brutality or any raids. She was fortunate to work in a club in one of the nicer hotels, actually, just near the airport. So for her, it was a little bit easier. But I did have a number of people who experienced police brutality, and I actually had 2 women who were forcibly deported once they went into the sex industry. But these women, I've talked to them since then. They said, look, I was likely going to get deported anyway. This way I went home with money in my pockets. So I think it's a mixed bag. It's not like everything is solved. But what I find interesting is that these women are electing. They find that the sex industry is going to be better. Like, they think that that's going to be that's going to be the way out for them. That's going to be the way for them to make money, and it's going to be more lucrative for them. It is interesting to note, even though the experiences once they get there are pretty varied.
No one else. Okay, a couple more questions.
Are there any reports that you find more helpful than the tip reports, like Human Rights Watch or any other organizations?
Yeah.
That are more accurate than what the State Department is doing?
Absolutely. The Human Rights Watch, in fact, actually has a fantastic report. It's called, I think, Building Towers, Cheating Workers, I believe is the name of the report. And it's really fantastic. And I've found some of the reports actually done by groups in the country, have been very helpful. Scalabrini Migration Center has a really great report out on the Gulf, and that's been done through compiling the testimonies of Filipinos who've come back to the Philippines from the Gulf. So those are two that I found really, really useful. But in general, it tends to be reports from people who spend a lot of time in country, and either that or they are based on the testimonies of actual migrants, as opposed to just kind of haphazard observation, because of course haphazard observation isn't going to work in a place like the Gulf.
Okay, one more. Yeah.
Hi. In the beginning of the talk, you said about the rule of Kampala and also, the influence that U.S. has on that. So could you elaborate, because I'm still not understanding as to why them being on the tier 2 watch list, and how did that really impact us? The trade policies, what was it that actually impacted and stopped the removal of Kampala?
Yeah, so when they were put on the tier 2 watch list, the focus of the government became getting off the tier 2 watch list, right, and moving up. And so their efforts went towards following the recommendations to a T. So the recommendations were increased prosecution at that time when they were first put on the tier 2 watch list. It was increased prosecutions of sex trafficking. So what that led to was government funding and energy and the police task force going on raids, essentially, as opposed to listening to these sort of groups of migrants' rights activists who were saying we should reform Kampala, we should abolish it like Bahrain has done. So the energy then became focused on following what the U.S. had asked them to do in order to get off the watch list, and so they did, right? So they followed that and they did get off the watch list. But you can understand that for economic reasons, being on the watch list is not desirable. So a country like Iran is less concerned about being on tier 3 because they're being sanctioned anyway, right? But a country like the Emirates does care where the U.S. is going to put them on a watch list. So they're going to do everything in their power to get off of that. And in fact, it's interesting that the first time that the UAE was put on the watch list, the kafala system wasn't even mentioned as a possible source of what I call structural violence.
Great, thank you, Pardis. And as I said, she may have to leave us, but you can always contact her if you have further questions. But thanks for being here. Okay, next, we're going to work our way down the table. And the next person who's going to be speaking is Aquilina Soriano-Versoza. She's the director of the Filipino Workers Center here in Southern California. And it's a nonprofit that serves and organizes low-wage Filipino and Latino immigrants in LA. She serves as the executive director of the PwC for 12 years and has been working in the Filipino community for 15 years, both here in Los Angeles and in the Philippines. She studied and got her BA in Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. The Filipino Workers Center has brought visibility to the realities of Filipino caregivers as a leader in California Domestic Workers Coalition and the National Domestic Workers Alliance. We've asked her to speak a little bit about the work that, some of the labor issues that are confronting the Filipino migrant worker community here in LA, and also to talk to us about and to think about whether the concept of trafficking is helpful or hurtful for advancing the PwC's organizational goals. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. So at the Filipino Workers Center, when we started, when folks thought about migrant Filipino labor or low-wage Filipino workers, they usually thought in the past tense to farm workers, the United Farm Workers, or overseas in Dubai, the Middle East, or Hong Kong. But they also didn't really think about low-wage Filipino workers here in the United States and what that looks like today. So Filipino Workers Center, what we set out to do was to really start to research and uncover what are the face of Filipino workers today, what are their issues, and then how can we collectively organize around these issues. So as we did our work, and we made connections into, we found whole apartment buildings of low-wage Filipino workers living together, and we found overwhelmingly that there were Filipino caregivers living and working one-on-one in individual homes all around California. And the networks are down through San Diego, up into the valleys, out into Oxnard, you know, anywhere where there's a need for a caregiver, there's a lot of times there's Filipinos who are working as caregivers. And as we progressed in our work, we actually didn't think of them at first as domestic workers. We made that connection with other domestic worker organizations. Domestic workers, in the 1930s, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, but two groups of workers were excluded from that act. And those were farm workers and domestic workers. The work that a lot of the Filipinos are, low-wage Filipino workers are in now, are in a sector that is also framed much around gender and race, and has legally been given less rights than other workers in the United States. Currently, on a federal level, caregivers fall under a companion exemption still, so they're not included under any labor protections. Even minimum wage laws, so not even thinking about overtime, meals and benefits, you know, just basic minimum wage protections, they're not included in. So we've worked with Department of Labor agents who see the abuse but are not able to do anything because a majority of our workers fall under this exemption. Fortunately, we are working on a national effort, and the recommendation was made last year by President Obama himself made the announcement that they were recommending for this exemption to be narrowed so that caregivers are actually included in their federal labor law. But it's been quite contentious, and it still has not been approved formally. And so we're also engaged in a statewide effort because for a California domestic workers bill of rights, because there are also a lot of rights that domestic workers still do not have that all other workers have. Domestic workers, and very specifically caregivers and nannies, are the last workers to not have overtime protections. Farm workers have been given protections in the last couple of years, and so domestic workers are the final group that are still denied. And so what we really found is that, you know, by creating these, you know, tiers in our law system, it maintains actually the reason for why they were excluded in the first place. In the 1930s, domestic workers and farm workers were excluded because the Southern Democrats did not want to shake up the racial hierarchy in the South. So at that time, they wanted to exclude all African Americans actually from any protections under labor law, federal labor law. But when they were told that that is not acceptable, they said, okay, well, let's exclude farm workers and domestic workers instead, because that's where they're mostly at. They're in the fields and they're in the homes. So that was the reason to exclude them. And until today, even though the demographic has changed, it's very much similar framework that justifies maintaining the inequalities. You know, these are primarily immigrant women working in the homes, and it really keeps it within the framework of servantry and servitude rather than as being seen as work and them seen as workers. In all of our efforts, actually the trafficking framework has actually been very helpful in bringing out issues and abuses of domestic workers, because it brings out the extremes where sometimes people, because of the racial and gender justifications don't necessarily see the need for, the rights for domestic workers to be able to sleep uninterrupted, even 5 or 8 hours of sleep a night. By seeing it in the trafficking framework, then, legislators start to understand better, make connections, and we can show how these inequalities in the labor law are also contributing to creating an environment that is creating exploitation and abuse to the extent of trafficking. So it's really, along a spectrum where it's very slippery slope, and you can show the trafficking victims, but you can show that the things that the trafficking survivors have experienced are very similar to what a lot of domestic workers who are not necessarily trafficking survivors are also experiencing in terms of the way they're treated. Part of our California Domestic Workers Bill of Rights is also access to used kitchen facilities. And as we've gone through the campaign, we have more and more stories from our members coming out where we should have also included access to showers and restrooms, because we have live-in workers who are denied the right to be able to cook their own food, denied the right to take showers, even though they're live-in workers. So the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, and there was the first Bill of Rights that was passed in New York 2 years ago, and we're definitely hoping to be the second state to pass the Bill of Rights. We had hoped to pass it last year. We got all the way through to the governor's desk, and unfortunately the governor vetoed it last September. Partly he seems to identify really more as an employer himself and doesn't want to regulate anything within the private home. So one framework that we're also using to try and reach him now as well is for him also to understand how not wanting to touch the private home also creates that space for abuse and trafficking conditions. For our own membership, I mean, domestic work, in the domestic work industry is where we're seeing, growing numbers of trafficking victims, trafficking survivors, and specifically caregivers as well. We have whole groups of them in Orange County that have been found and brought into the network, and also here in our own membership, we have probably about 5% of the cases that we see end up being trafficking cases. One of our cases was a woman from the Philippines who was a teacher, but was brought here. She went abroad because she was the matriarch of the family and needed to support the rest of the family. Her small wages as a rural teacher were not enough, so she went abroad with a family. A woman from their neighborhood, or from their, not necessarily their neighborhood, but in their area, who was from that region, and her husband, and she thought she was going to be a caregiver for the mother. And when she got there, they took her passport, and it was just here in Culver City. They took her passport, and for 2 years, she was pretty much shut in this gated community in a house. The wife was Filipina, the husband was Caucasian, and a lawyer who worked for Sony. And she was on a daily basis verbally and physically abused. She ate the food that they thought was no longer good for them. She slept on a dog's bed and was made to dress up in little maid's outfits to look nice for when the friends came over to serve them. So she actually is a landmark case because she decided to stand up to the lawyer and to to take prosecution all the way through. And so she actually, after she was actually injured, she was hit by a bottle from her employer, and her head was cut open, and she ran out, and the neighbors saw that. And so that is what actually started the process of her being able to escape from that situation. And she was being paid about $200 a day, but $200 a month, with always deductions for work that they didn't like. Like if they didn't think she washed a shirt properly, they would deduct the entire amount of the shirt from her paycheck. And they also gave her loans as well, so she was indebted to them. And they used her own power and threatened her that, you know, they knew they were influential in her area, in the homeland, so that she felt very, very, you know, powerless. But she was able to get out, and then she was able to stand up, and she was able to win both a civil case, which won her millions of dollars, and a criminal case as well, against the wife who did really the daily abuse to her, as well as the husband being disbarred. So, but this helped to raise some of the visibility of human trafficking in the Filipino community, and some of her family didn't know what was happening until they saw the news coverage actually in the Philippines. So,
Aquilina?
Yes.
I think we
wrap
should,
up.
yeah, we should just wrap it up.
Okay, sure. And so, yeah. So it's been helpful in many ways to use the trafficking framework as far as being able to really highlight and bring out the worst abuses, but then, you know, the whole spectrum of abuses that domestic workers face here.
Great, and I think you raised some really important points here. I'm trying to figure out, okay, what are some of the common threads, but this relationship between policy and organizing, the kind of grassroots policy that can maybe address some of the issues that Pardis talked about some of the limitations of rights and policy making around domestic worker, you know, in this case, domestic workers, and trafficking is very important and something that will continue as we move along through this discussion. So, next up, we have Chancee Martorell, who's the founder and director of the Thai Community Development Center, and then she graduated from UCLA with a BA in Political Science and an MA in Urban Planning, as did I. There are a lot of, what we find is there are many urban planners from UCLA running amok and causing trouble. So she specialized in with a specialization in urban regional development. She's also studied humanities at Chiang Mai University in northern Thailand and engaged in social activism for the past 20 years. She's the executive director of, as I said, the Thai the Community Development Center, a nonprofit organization that she founded in 1994 in an effort to improve the lives of Thai immigrants through the services that promote cultural adjustment and economic self-sufficiency. She's most well known for her work on several major human rights cases involving Thai victims of human trafficking. We asked her to talk a little bit about what happened in 1995 among the slave shop case and what role the Thai CDC played in this. And then as well as to think about how the concept of trafficking plays itself out in meeting the needs and rights of affected workers. Chancee, thanks.
Thank you. Well, I'll begin by saying that first and foremost, the Thai Community Development Center was a migrant rights organization before we were an anti-human trafficking organization, and continue to be a migrant rights organization. We believe in the idea that all migrants have a basic right to decent standard of living and a quality of life. And migrants here deserve to know what those rights are, but unfortunately are living in substandard housing and lack access to basic health services, education, quality employment, and a whole host of other amenities. We're trying to advance their social and economic well-being through a very comprehensive community development strategy that includes human rights advocacy, affordable housing, access to healthcare, promotion of small businesses, and labor empowerment and social enterprises. We started our work on anti-human trafficking in the U.S. before many people even knew what it was back in 1995, about 18 years ago, with the discovery of 6 dozen Thai nationals working in conditions of slavery in a makeshift garment factory in El Monte, California. This case became a landmark case because it became known as the first case of modern-day slavery in the U.S. And Thai CDC played a pivotal role
that included being part of the raid that liberated the workers and gave them their freedom, fighting for their successful release from INS detention, rendering emergency relief, providing food, clothing, shelter, medical care, securing their identification and work authorizations, placing them in jobs, helping them pursue civil redress and criminal prosecution, organizing them as part of the retailer accountability campaign, helping them secure their visas before the T visa even existed, preventing them from being deported after the successful prosecution of their traffickers, and organizing a coalition of civil immigrant workers' rights organizations to pursue justice for the workers, including reaching the $4 million settlement from retailers. The concept of trafficking was a new phenomenon at the time, and people had a hard time understanding how individuals can be victims. Thai CDC did a lot of awareness raising, a lot of education. Law enforcement, unfortunately, was not sensitive to trafficking and did not consider foreign nationals without status as victims. Victims were treated as quote-unquote illegal aliens who needed to be deported. No one understood the real threat and fear of retaliation against victims and their family members should they be sent back home. One of the most important thing I thought that the Almaty case was pivotal in is that it had served as a really major case to receive national and even international attention, where we had these divisions of race and class and language and ethnicity wiped away to form this very single united movement focused on the combined issues of human rights and social and economic justice for all migrant workers. It was really what a lot of people don't realize, the first labor struggle of global proportions that our city has seen, and it really proved that if capital could redraw the old boundaries in its favor, so could its people. Now, since the Almaty case, because that was the tip of the iceberg in 1995, we've worked on a half dozen more cases. Given that Thailand has become a major source country for trafficked persons and US has become a popular destination country, Thai CDC is the only Thai organization in the US addressing this persistent problem of human trafficking from Thailand into the US. We provide an immediate response team that arranges shelter, food, clothing, medical care, legal counsel for the victims. We help them overcome their trauma, develop their survival and self-sufficiency skills, prepare them to seek redress and restitution through various legal channels. We mobilize the workers also, and all the efforts have led to really this movement against human trafficking and slavery in the US, and a lot of reforms, like in the garment industry, for example, and legislation to protect future traffic victims, like the TVPA, and also this broader definition of human trafficking to include all forms of slavery, like slavery-like practices such as contract and debt bondage labor, and also led to the founding of, in 1998, the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, which we were instrumental in, and the education and training of law enforcement and service providers, creating this continuum of care network, and greater awareness of this serious problem, which unfortunately and sadly persists today unabated. And so some of the other cases that we were involved in after the Almaty case, we came to the aid of yet another Thai garment workers case back in 1996. And then in 97, we came to the aid of Thai women who had been trafficked for sexual slavery. Then in 1998, we had sought redress and restitution for Thai domestic workers. That case set an important precedent in the fact that we were able to prosecute the employer and trafficker on the basis of psychological coercion, not just physical coercion. And then we, in 2000, were able to get and obtain the first T visa on the Thai boy case. And then in 2006, after a 5-year battle, we helped a group of Thai welders, 49 Thai welders, reach a $1.4 million settlement against Transbay Steel Corporation for civil rights violation, employing a civil means of justice versus criminal means, because that case was not criminally prosecuted, and that was what we worked on with EEOC, that case, which you'll hear about next as well. And this case was also the first recognized male legal contract labor case of modern-day slavery. And then from 2003 until the present, we have been seeking redress and restitution for 1,100 Thai farm workers. This case has now become the largest human trafficking case in U.S. history. Trafficking cases, as I have described, take all forms. Unfortunately, in the U.S., especially during the Bush era, the administration presupposes that the victims are women and girls trafficked for sex. But we have found more and more these individuals are predominantly men and trafficked for slavery-like practices and forced labor. And the cases that we have actually came to the aid of, they are, every single one of them are multifaceted in nature. As many of you know who work in this field combating human trafficking and maybe providing direct services to victims, you of course know that paramount concern, first and foremost, is the welfare of the workers upon their liberation or discovery. So we have to really use a human rights framework to address the needs of workers. TITC, as I had mentioned, began first with their welfare, safety, and emergency relief and resettlement assistance, with all the necessary self-sufficiency skills that they need and basic survival English skills, their health and medical treatments and care, and also, of course, there's the legal aspect of each case, and the legal aspect, you have to be concerned about how they can be prepared to perhaps testify if they choose to become material witnesses in the prosecution of the traffickers. So then there's the criminal case, then there's the civil redress and restitution, and we try to exhaust all means to really get them restitution, and so we sometimes work with Department of Labor, with Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and even consider private civil lawsuits or tort claims, etc. And then of course there's the immigration aspect, trying to make sure that they get the status so they're not in limbo and are able to really continue a life that will help them become self-sufficient and independent and free individuals and productive individuals. Now, what we have found in the Almonte case is a good case that illustrates really how modern labor relations are now being used to hide the new slavery, because the Almonte case had elements of indentured servitude, debt bondage, coercion, and contract slavery. The workers were forced to work 17 hours a day for as long as 7 years. Their passports and IDs were appropriated by their captors. Armed guards kept surveillance of the workers 24/7. Workers, their families back home were threatened, and workers were cut off from all contact with the outside world. Mail was censored, phone calls were monitored, windows were boarded up, complex was surrounded by barbed wire. Workers were threatened with deportation if escaped. They had to purchase personal food and supplies from the company's store at exorbitant prices. They worked hours on end to pay off their legal debt and assumed this debt through an illegal contract. That was just, as I mentioned, the tip of the iceberg, because we are seeing more what we call legalized form of slavery, like in the case of the Thai welders who were brought here on H-2B visas, and then the current case of the Thai farm workers who were brought here on H-2A visas, and the other one was H-2B visas. And these contracts are offered as guaranteed employment, perhaps in a workshop, in a factory, in a farm, but then workers are taken to their place of work and then find themselves enslaved. So contracts are used as an enticement to trick the individual to slavery and making the slavery look legitimate. But the reality is that contract worker is a slave or has become a slave, is is threatened with violence, and they lack freedom of movement, they're paid nothing, and then plus they are tacked on this exorbitant, enormous debt that they can never pay off, and sometimes lose their ancestral homeland as a result because the loan shark back in their home country take that homeland away from them. So we really need to use this human rights framework when we combat human trafficking, as mentioned earlier. That is the tool to combating human trafficking. And we heard earlier there's sometimes a conflation between trafficking and smuggling. That needs to really be eliminated, and law enforcement need to further be trained and educated. We also really need to understand that together as civil rights organization, immigrant rights organization, we can actually forge a movement that will address this issue, because it's an issue that should be taken on by labor unions, by civil rights leaders, by immigrant rights advocates. It's going to be more powerful if we can forge a stronger, more powerful union, because I think what we have discovered in our work to combat trafficking, what constitutes real social change is challenging all the underlying cultural values which govern relations between genders and social classes. And it's really ultimately this work which challenges the existing power structure and caste system that makes trafficking possible, that places so many people at risk of losing their most basic human rights. So we need to challenge that. And then we heard earlier the more kind of the macro causation of trafficking. We need to fight a lot of those structural also causes of trafficking. I mean, there are new factors that are causing a new form of slavery. I mean, global capitalism, the new world economy, making capital more mobile in search of cheaper labor, a lot of the armed conflict that's occurring in the world and corrupt governments, the rapid socioeconomic change that's increasing the gap between the poor and the rich in developing countries, emphasis on economic growth versus sustainable development in the developing world, and a lot of indirect value of slave labor to the world economy, extraordinary profits reaped from slave-produced goods, consumers seeking bargains. I mean, those are things that we should be really understanding as factors causing a form of slavery. So,
thank you very much. Okay, so a lot to think about there, and again, this question about framing, right, is a thing that continues to emerge, especially in that discussion about having to reframe the way that people see these individuals. You know, on the one hand, being able to discuss them as workers, but also as a certain type of victim that changes the way that people discuss it in policy terms, right? And I think it's an important theme that continues to emerge from all of these discussions. So, next up, we have David Lopez, who's the General Counsel with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. He was sworn in on April 8, 2010 by President Barack Obama and was confirmed by the Senate on December 22, 2010. As General Counsel, Mr. Lopez oversees the Commission's federal court litigation of the 15 EEOC district offices. And during his tenure, he has devoted significant time to develop a formidable systemic program nationwide, as well as to build a strong trial program. He has extensive experience in this area, and he's developed several high-impact cases and successfully tried them on behalf of the EEOC. He is the co-chair of the committee charged with developing the Commission's strategic enforcement plan, and he is also the chair of the Commission's immigrant worker team, a team that is asked to identify ways to strengthen the EEOC's enforcement and outreach on the cross-cutting issues affecting workers of foreign national origin. Okay, so thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. I also want to thank the organizers, and I found this conference to be very interesting because I am a relative newbie to the various conceptual, empirical, and law enforcement issues surrounding the whole issue of human trafficking. I have devoted a good portion of my professional career to civil rights litigation, and it is that voice that I hope to bring to this discussion. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is responsible for enforcing the anti-discrimination laws in American workplaces. The laws that prohibit discrimination based on race, sex, national origin, age, disability. As the general counsel, I am responsible for the litigation efforts, but the EOC also does extensive outreach. We engage in policy. We use various tools to try to eradicate discrimination. Last October, I had the fortune of being invited to a conference sponsored by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, discussing human trafficking. The conference was held in Vienna, and it was advertised as one of the first of its kind conferences to examine discrimination as a vulnerability factor contributing to human trafficking. So the focus of this conference was on the role of combating sexism and racism as a way to address the problem of human trafficking, because I think there's an international recognition that these are some of the fundamental power disparities that lead to human trafficking. The reason that I was invited is because the EOC, in some respects, has taken a very pioneering role within the context of the American legal system in using the anti-discrimination laws to address issues of human trafficking. I think there was a discussion earlier today about civil remedies to address human trafficking. What we do is we enforce the anti-discrimination laws, and we've done that in situations that involve individuals who were trafficked to the United States in very, very horrific situations. I want to talk about a couple of cases to sort of illustrate how this is done. The first case that I want to talk about is a case that our regional attorney in Dallas, Robert Canino, learned about through some connections with his church group. And he's an extremely innovative, extremely creative attorney. And this is a case called Cheyenne and the EOC versus John Pickle. This case involved 52 skilled Indian workers who were recruited to the United States to work in a factory in Oklahoma. When they got here, their passports were confiscated. They were paid less than the minimum wage. They were restrained in substandard living conditions. There was an armed guard to protect them.